Hello, Teach Now. I'm going to be going over how my unit plan went and my lessons, of course. So, how effective you would rate your initial planning of the unit? I really liked how I planned out, my first unit plan. I really liked the topic that I picked. For example, I picked exponents, and exponents was something that there's so many different types of problems you can do with exponents, like divisions and fractions and negatives and the power rule, multiplication. So there's so much that I could go over that let me not make it only one lesson but several lessons. So I really like that I did that. I really like the formative assessments that I had put into my unit plan because I put various, and I think that's very helpful because when it comes to teaching, I feel like one formative assessment not might work for one child, but it might work for another one. And I think that's gonna work to my. I thought I was like, oh, this is gonna work to my benefit when teaching, having all these different formative assessments. And as far as how I planned these lessons to come out. Like lesson one is this, lesson two is this, lesson three, lesson four. I think I really enjoyed that. I ended up keeping that same format for my final unit plan. Number two, what led to revisions in the lesson plans and or unit? I think most of the changes came down to first is multiculturalism. I didn't think of this before. That I don't think many people would think about it beforehand. But as soon as it was brought to my attention by teaching out, like, hey, it's important to be multicultural in your lessons. Uh, that's when I made the change. It was kind of hard for me to think of how to make math multicultural because math is a universal language. And so when I saw it, I was like, oh gosh, like math doesn't really have a culture, versus, like English. English, there's tons of cultures that you can go over in English, but in math, math is math. The same math you're doing here is the same math you're doing in Europe and in Russia and China, Japan, wherever across the planet. It's the same thing. So when I looked over that, I had to think of something, and I had to see something that like would be different, but also be in like inside of culture. So my first thought was, I'm gonna do something that has to do with Roman numerals, but I ended up finding uh, Mayan numbers, and I thought, I could, use Mayan numbers and implement into one of the lesson plans, and then teach a little bit about the Mayan culture and like their future and what they became, which is like Mexico, Guatemala, and everything. So teach a little bit about that, and that's how I would be able to um, implement the multiculturalism. Uh, Other changes, other revisions. Like for example, innovative strategies. Some of my formal assessments I added to my formal assessments because I feel like more formal assessments would give me more flexibility and it would help me teach even better. As I mentioned before, what one strategy might not work for one kid, but it might work for another one. So I think that really helped to my benefit. Another thing is differentiated instructions. I didn't have many differentiated instructions, and to begin with in my initial unit plan. So when I was able to look a little further into the different kinds of diversity, I think it really helped that that I looked, that we made that chart inside the lesson plan for uh, for differentiated instructions. So, what insights did you gain from the lesson planning process and teaching a lesson? Um, Sometimes what I learned is that I want when I was teaching the lesson, it's not the same on paper as it is up there. One, like this, my students that I had for my lesson, they were a little, they were goofy, which is not bad, but I, I think for the most part, what I learned was that I have to practice. Because if I don't practice the lesson and I just go up there, I feel I'm gonna do terrible. So next time around, I think for as far as the teaching, the lesson goes, I want to practice the lesson beforehand. Give a little speech. It doesn't matter if it's in front of like a dog, but just to have beforehand, how I'm gonna teach it. So I think that's very important as far as the lesson plan, the planning of the planning process goes, and how I teach it. What parts of the unit emerge as critical to its implementation? I think the formative assessments, because the formative assessments is what it's going to teach the students the most. Because in math, it's all about practice. You practice, 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 practice. Because these are just concepts. So to me, the important part is that they understand this concept, and the best way to do that is for them, as I said 20 times before, is to practice. And these formative assessments allows the students to practice. So I was really happy that I was able to find, I think it was like 5 or 6 different types of formative assessments, so that the students are able to learn in different fashions. So I had, I think the formative assessments that I had were, hold on, give me 1 second. It was worksheets, which is more traditional. I had Math IXL, which is online, Prodigy, which is totally like a game. We're kind of like, think of it as Pokemon, where kids can battle. A thing called Quizzes, which is also online, a group versus group, which is implementing just very competitive inside the classroom. Flashcards, and Jeopardy. I think that Jeopardy ended up being one of the ones that I ended up putting in at the end of my lesson. And like I said before, I think the formative assessments is like the most critical part, because this is how they're learning most of the material. It's all the practice that they're doing so that they can understand these problems. How did the planning process help you determine how you would know whether the students were meeting the objectives, developing an understanding of the content, and attaining the expected skills? For the most part, I like I said before, I relied a lot on the formative assessments. I have worked with kids in the past, and there's different formative assessments. A lot of them are worksheets, and that's how I know if they're meeting these objectives before I even give them a summative, assessment. You're in the classroom, and these kids, like, they a lot of the times, other they don't get it right away. So when they're doing these formative assessments, they'll raise their hand, they'll ask a question, be like, "Hey, how do I do this?" So once I give them several formative assessments, I'll see which concept they are, struggling with, and which ones they're not. And I think formative assessments, like I said before, is really helpful to see if the students are going to meet that objective, and not necessarily because a student is bad at one concept, they're going to be bad at another one. A lot of times, one kid might not understand one concept very well, but another concept is just, they're a genius at. So I think formative assessments are very important when planning. It will help me determine whether the students are meeting the objectives, if they're understanding the content, and they're attaining the expected skills. Predicted student engagement, skill attainment, and your plan assessing student understanding. So yeah, like I said before, for the most part, I think formative assessments were the big thing here. It's what helped me out the most, and I think that's what's going to help me out the most in class. And if I become a math teacher, I think this is what's going to help me the most, formative assessments, because it's the practice that's going to help these kids understand these concepts more and more. Thank you.